Welcome back to the start of our second session today, titled National Identities and International Relations. This presentation will have two speakers, Edward Sullivan and Max Mishler. Edward Sullivan is the Helen Gould Sheppard Professor of History of Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. He is the author of over 25 books and exhibition catalogs on subjects relating to the art of the Americas, the Caribbean, the Iberian Peninsula. Among his most recent publications are The Language of Objects in the Art of the Americas, Continental Shifts, The Art of Edward Duval Carrier, Fragile Demon, Juan Soriano in Mexico, 1935 to 50, and Nueva York, 1613 to 1945. He is currently working on a book to be entitled From San Juan to Paris and Back, Francisco Oller and Caribbean Art in the Era of Impressionism. Max Mishler is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of History at New York University. His dissertation examines the origins of the penitentiary in New York during the early Republic and its relationship to the broader processes of emancipation and state formation. He has co-taught undergraduate courses on Puerto Rican history and is currently researching the relationship between U.S. Reconstruction and U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico.
Thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you everyone for this extraordinarily stimulating day. I have been at this for many, many, many years, and when I started, nothing like this would have been happening, and I couldn't be more thrilled to see so many colleagues and friends and students, and it is just absolutely amazing. So thank you for the brilliant organization. Puerto Rican artist Francisco Oller, who was born in 1833 and died in 1917, painted the portrait of American President William McKinley shortly after the end of the Spanish-American War. This conflict had resulted in the termination of the long history of Spanish colonialism in the Americas. Cuba and Puerto Rico, as well as the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific, were lost to Spain. Cuba became nominally independent, although economically reliant upon the United States, whereas Puerto Rico became a colony of the power to the north. This hieratic image of McKinley, reminiscent of formal Renaissance or early modern portraiture by artists such as Titian or Diego Velázquez, depicts the president in a three-quarters pose facing left. He is shown in his White House office, its walls covered with panels of rich yellow fabric. In his left hand, he holds a map of the island, featuring the western half of the nation, which we can see here. On the map appears the inscription 25th of July, 1898, the date of the American invasion, which was begun at Guanica in the southern portion of the country, approximately 30 miles west of Ponce. The map rests on a table covered with green fabric, an elaborate inkwell in the form of a golden column with a golden column with an American eagle at its crest also rests on the table. The work is signed at the lower left, F. Oller, Puerto Rico, 18th of October, 1898, a rather odd way of writing the 18th of October. This painting presents us with many fascinating paradoxes. It is mentioned only in passing in Osiris Delgado's incomplete catalogue raisonné of Oller, published in 1983, when the picture's location was unknown. The work only surfaced on the art market several years ago after more than 100 years in obscurity and was purchased by a collector in Ponce. It is likely to have been sent to Washington by way of the administration of the first American governors of the island, possibly John R. Brooke. Brooke and two other American military and after 1900 civil governors had also been portrait subjects of the artist. We might ask, does this painting represent a statement of the artist's political affiliations? Throughout his career, Oller expressed interest in such social issues as abolitionism and universal education. Yet he never wrote or, insofar as we know, made any pronouncements in favor of one form of government or another. although many of his students, friends, and associates had worked for either autonomy or independence from Spain and had independentista sympathies after 1898. Oller's conflicted affinities, his desire for official recognition and patronage from the occupiers of the island while maintaining his deep concerns for the integrity of Puerto Rican culture, are encapsulated in this portrait. Furthermore, Oller's likeness of William McKinley may be comprehended on a variety of levels which speak to the artist's engagement with Puerto Rican political and art historical traditions. Portraiture, in fact, constituted a major element in the artistic production of Francisco Oller, seen here in a 1903 self-portrait. His early training in San Juan included copying both religious and secular pictures by artists of the past. These included this version of a self-portrait by the most famous Puerto Rican artist of the late 18th century, José Campeche. Oller had been thoroughly immersed in academic art through his experiences at the Academy of San Fernando in Madrid. There he studied with Federico de Madrazo, a prominent Spanish student of Ingres, and later with Thomas Couture in his first Parisian period, which lasted from 1858 to 1865. Oller later spent the years 1873 to 1884 between Paris and Madrid, returning to Paris for a final sojourn between 1895 and 6. Oller absorbed a wide variety of visual stimuli, all of which served as nourishment for the creation of his original forms of Impressionist and Realist art, making him a singular force in the development of a transatlantic visuality between the Caribbean and Western Europe between the 1860s and the 1910s. This can be observed in his impressive series of landscapes, still lifes, history compositions, and portraits. Depictions of Spanish officials, such as the General Francisco Enrique Contreras, occupied Oller during the 1870s and 80s. In 1871, he painted a portrait of King Amadeo I of Spain, which was received so successfully at court that Oller was named Pintor del Rey, or Painter to the King, the following year. Closer to home, Oller's later portraits included a number of images that constituted the gallery of illustrious Puerto Ricans, which had been commissioned by the Ateneo Puertorriqueño, the premier center of scholarly and artistic activity on the island. These included the lyrically suggestive images of poet José Gautier Benítez and that of Rafael Cordero, founder of the first school for slave children and sons of freed slaves. In his series for the Ateneo, Oller succeeded in suggesting the richness and depth of Puerto Rican artistic, literary, and intellectual production. Switching gears rather dramatically, immediately after the establishment of the U.S. presence on the island, Oller painted the military governor, General George Davis, in 1900. With imposing formality and dressed in full military regalia, Davis looks out as if to assert his power over all who may approach him from afar. As described by Puerto Rican art historian María Benítez, Oller's depiction of Davis indicates his iron-handed rule of the island at a time during its initial colonial phase when a number of popular uprisings expressed local disenchantment with the new American policies. Whereas Oller painted Davis from life in a reception room at La Fortaleza, the governor's residence and office, the artist depicted an equally stern McKinley, whom he had never met, from a photographic likeness. Oller took great pains to suggest what he imagined to be the richness of the background of the presidential office, with its walls covered with pale yellow fabric. President McKinley also faces in the same direction as did Davis in his portrait, his face marked with a singular determination. The detail of the slightly crumpled map of Puerto Rico in his hand, as we saw, leaves no room for misunderstanding of the firmness of the policies he has in mind for America's newest colony. We know, in fact, the source for the McKinley portrait. It is the last image in an extensive album entitled Photographic History of the Spanish-American War, a pictorial and descriptive record of the events on land and sea with portraits and biographies of leaders on both sides, published in New York in 1898 by the Pearson Publishing Company immediately after the end of the conflict. A powerful propaganda tool, this book was widely disseminated. Its popularity can be traced in good part to the plentiful number of often dramatic photographs of the events in Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico by unnamed press photographers. The bust-length photograph of the president is the last image in this lengthy volume, appearing as both conqueror and peacekeeper in the spirit of a classical deus ex machina. While some engravings were included in this book, the bulk of the images in it are photographs, such as those depicting Puerto Rican food vendors feeding U.S. troops. Although another photograph in the book depicts General Nelson Miles, who led the invasion of Puerto Rico. We don't see it here, but nonetheless. And the text for that photograph describes the Americans as provoking, quote, most perfect good feeling being continually evinced on the part of the inhabitants of the villages through which the army passes. Rhetoric which is eerily, to me, reminiscent of the pre- and immediate post-invasion stages of the Iraq War in 2003. While Oller's McKinley portrait is an elaboration of the anonymous photograph, there are other visual factors at work in the creation of this painting. What would the artist have used as his stimulus for elaborating on this image? I suggest that he had in mind the work of José Campeche, his artistic predecessor, who he deeply admired and whose career trajectory he strongly identified with. Campeche's most famous official portrait was done 100 years before Oller's McKinley portrait. Don Miguel de Ostadis served as Spanish governor and captain general of the island from 1789 to 1792. Among his major accomplishments were the modernization of the capital and the paving of its streets, an activity suggested by the genre detail in the distance at the left and the map of the city beside him. We cannot say for certain that Oller knew this painting, as he did many other works of Campeche, because it had been recorded in the Ustadis family in Spain until the 20th century. Nonetheless, copies of it were frequent, and Oller may certainly have been familiar with a reproduction. Francisco Oller's likeness of William McKinley was among other portraits of the president painted in the late 1890s, the most well-known by Swiss-born American artist August Benzinger, now in the National Portrait Gallery right here in this same building. This painting was commissioned by Vice President Garrett A. Hobart and he executed, and Benzinger executed, two portraits of the president who posed for the artist in the East Room of the White House in 1897 and 1898. Thus, there's an oddly serendipitous relationship between Oller's paintings and that by Benzinger. While we know that McKinley was extremely impressed with Benzinger's work, we have no notice whatsoever of his reaction to the Puerto Rican artist's painting, or even if he ever saw it, as details of its shipment to Washington and its subsequent fate are cloudy at best. Oller's portrait of William McKinley represents more questions than it solves. What were the artist's intentions in painting it? He obviously hoped to gain official recognition from the powers in Washington, who, in the end, ignored the painter from America's newest colony. Perhaps McKinley's well-documented pleasure in the Swiss-American artist Benzinger's likenesses of him overshadowed any enthusiasm he might have had for the Oller. On the other hand, we might also consider the question of political affinities and loyalties in the case of Oller. A highly discreet artist, although someone who was outspoken regarding social issues, Oller did not commit any of his political leanings to paper. He seems to have been a realist in more than one sense. His designation as painter to the King of Spain, almost 30 years earlier, had obviously helped him to gain more commissions and aid him financially. Oller's many likenesses of illustrious Puerto Rican artistic figures for the Ateneo represented his pride in the cultural accomplishments of his home. But when the prevailing political winds began blowing from the north, he seems not to have hesitated in promoting himself as the single Puerto Rican artist capable of depicting the images, both literal and figurative, of the new social order. Yet the question of his emotional and nationalist affinities remains in the air. Oller was certainly an entrepreneurial artist, but did he paint his American subjects from the heart? The answer will never really be known.
In Francisco Oller's reverential portrait, William McKinley is clearly a man with a plan. His fixed gaze and firm grip on a map of Puerto Rico suggests boldness and methodical leadership. This is precisely what we would expect from an artist in search of employment from the new colonial authorities. Yet the imposing physicality of McKinley, in contrast to the small, crumpled map of Puerto Rico also suggests domination and claims to ownership. McKinley holds all of Puerto Rico in one hand. Oller undoubtedly saw McKinley as a powerful man, yet he was more than just the current president of the United States. McKinley also embodied the abolitionist, modernizing, and imperial legacies of a late 19th century Republican Party that ushered in 20th century American empire. It is unclear whether Oller viewed McKinley's power primarily as a symbol of colonial domination or as a force capable of modernizing Puerto Rico and offering a majority of Puerto Ricans new socio-political opportunities. This ambivalence reflects the way in which novel social development and unprecedented subjugation were co-constitutive parts of U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. Oller's personal experiences, combined with his knowledge of McKinley's political background, strongly suggest that there is a subtextual comment on U.S. occupation embedded within this portrait. Francisco Oller was the most cosmopolitan of Puerto Ricans in the 19th century. Traveling between Europe and the Caribbean, his own peregrinations mirrored the circulation of emerging ideologies of scientific rationalism, modernization, abolitionism, republican governance, and social equality that came to define the 19th century Atlantic world. Oller traveled in the same social circles as Ramón Emeterio Betances and other Puerto Ricans who spearheaded campaigns for political autonomy from Spain, improved public health and education in Puerto Rico, and the abolition of slavery. Oller's embrace of these worldly ideas subtly manifest in his various paintings of Puerto Rican society, and his own efforts to build schools for working-class Puerto Ricans made him uniquely aware of the contradictions of a U.S. colonial system that promised social development even as it undermined Puerto Rican self-governance and cultural autonomy. William McKinley was the last Civil War veteran to be elected president of the United States and the first president in what would become the American century. He governed during a key moment in the Republican transition from the party of free labor, abolitionism, and Reconstruction to the party of big business and imperialism. McKinley began his public career as a young but vocal abolitionist in the 1850s and grew into a Republican Party activist during the Civil War. Following the Union victory in 1865, Republican legislators codified the abolition of American slavery and introduced a program of Reconstruction that redistributed power in Southern society by expanding the franchise to African American men and by instituting a wage labor economic system. McKinley was an adamant supporter of Reconstruction in general and black political rights in particular. The Civil War also enshrined an alliance between the Republicans and Northern business interests, as Republicans came to espouse an industrial vision of economic growth. This included improvements in transportation and infrastructure, scientific management, an integrated national economy, free trade, and government investment in public health, hygiene, and education. Modernization and Reconstruction, and the colonization of Indian land, reflected the federal government's new capacity to coordinate military campaigns and socioeconomic development on a national level. Following the contested elections of 1877, however, McKinley and his party turned their attention away from Reconstruction and racial equality to promote instead American industry and U.S. spheres of influence abroad. This Janus-faced nature of Republican rule, a legacy of anti-slavery and modernization, combined with pro-business and expansionist policies, proved vexing to a generation of Latin American intellectuals who identified their own national aspirations with the U.S. Republican tradition, but feared North American imperial ambitions. The fact that a Republican administration invaded Puerto Rico in July of 1898 decisively shaped the subsequent development of colonial governance and U.S. colonial policy more generally. U.S. involvement in Puerto Rico grew out of a larger geopolitical conflict brought about by the Cuban insurrections against Spain, political events that presented both lucrative opportunities and moral dilemmas for many North Americans. When McKinley was elected president in 1896, however, he was a staunch opponent of aggressive foreign policy, in spite of political pressure to intervene in Cuba on behalf of North American interests. Yet within 3 years, McKinley's administration established U.S. imperial power in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. By 1899, McKinley could confidently tell a Boston audience, quote, "Now Cuba and Puerto Rico are ours, one temporarily, the other forever." The isolationist McKinley of 1896 now spoke of Puerto Rico as a permanent possession. McKinley's emergence as an imperialist had not been inevitable, but instead reflected the evolution of his Republican Party between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the Spanish-American War in 1898. McKinley, however, was far from an overt imperialist. In his 1897 inaugural address, he stated, quote, "We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression." While these words may have been mere politics veiling the way business interests determined his foreign policy, the documentary evidence suggests McKinley was sincerely anxious about initiating U.S. empire abroad. The question then is, why would his administration establish a territorial colony in Puerto Rico so quickly, and with what justifications? Compared with Cuba and the Philippines, Puerto Rico had always played an economically and politically marginal role in the Spanish Empire. There was no local elite capable of providing sufficient resources or ideological coherence to the type of Creole revolution that had sprung up throughout mainland Latin America and Cuba during the 19th century. Few Puerto Ricans openly militated for independence from Spain. When the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico in July of 1898, they encountered more welcome parades than hostile resistance. The lack of domestic insurgency led U.S. commentators to describe Puerto Rico as less savage than Cuba or the Philippines, while simultaneously portraying the island as an innocent child in need of protection from Spain and its own backwardness. Thus, very quickly, Puerto Rico assumed its 20th century role as a place to showcase American power and modernization schemes. In contrast to Puerto Rico, McKinley publicly recognized that the people of Cuba, quote, "are and of right ought to be free and independent." He claimed his administration lacked any, quote, "disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for the pacification thereof." No such affirmation of sovereignty was ever uttered about Puerto Rico. Instead, McKinley and the Republicans inaugurated a new type of colonialism on the island that combined the military occupation of old-fashioned empire with limited electoral government and subsidized development programs. In response to domestic criticism that he was establishing a global empire antithetical to Republican values, McKinley insisted that the occupation of Puerto Rico was more tutelage than dominance. He presented U.S. colonialism as a means to introduce democratic governance and modernity to a, quote, backward island, a backward and suffering island. The creation of a public education system was central to McKinley's vision. He told Congress, quote, "The fundamental requirement for these people, as for all people, is education. The free schoolhouse is the best preceptor for citizenship and will commend to them the blessings of free government." The U.S. colonial regime did construct an impressive system of public education in Puerto Rico, which enrolled 120,000 students between 1901 and 1910 and established a public university in San Juan in 1904. Oller actively participated in these initiatives. The U.S. military presence also opened up space for Afro-Puerto Ricans, women, and workers to organize for social and economic rights. The establishment of an elected bicameral legislature in Puerto Rico with universal male suffrage in 1904 hinted at a new era of democratic participation on the island. These political transformations and new opportunities for professional advancement, combined with sizable investments in education and infrastructure, made unilateral opposition to U.S. colonialism a difficult stance for men like Oller. Such developments, however, never brought about the free government with which they were initially associated. The U.S. government continued to appoint North Americans to top political and judiciary posts, abrogating Puerto Rico's sovereignty. Further, even modernization efforts that yielded salutary effects for Puerto Ricans were couched in a racist and paternalistic language. In Puerto Rico, colonial development reflected the ideologies of Jim Crow America and social Darwinist thought prevalent at the time. We do not know exactly which aspects of this colonial reality informed Oller's assessment of McKinley as he painted this portrait. Oller was familiar with McKinley's abolitionist past and the Reconstruction legacy of the Republican Party. He saw firsthand the fruits of social spending by U.S. authorities, especially in areas like education. He also understood power. Oller proactively and successfully sought out patronage of colonial officials. Yet it is doubtful that Oller was blind to the paternalistic and racist language of U.S. colonial projects, or to the increasing political and cultural subordination of Puerto Rico to the United States. Like many Puerto Ricans, then and now, Oller's struggle to articulate a coherent position on U.S. colonialism, reflected in this portrait, reflected the conflicted affinities of individuals operating within American empire.
Our next speaker is Kirsten Einfeldt, who is the director of Synapse, the International Curators Network at, I'm going to have to use my best German here, Haus, okay, the House of World Cultures, with Daniela Wolf, and teaches art theory and history at the University of the Arts in Bremen. She is also a program coordinator and curator at the House of World Cultures. Einfeldt was a founding member and curator of Plumas 7, Platform for Contemporary Art from Mexico, Mexico City, Berlin, with Gonzalo Ortega and Angelica Chio. Her most recent publications are Meridian 1 Urban Curatorial Projects on Health, edited with Daniela Wolf, Modern Art in Mexico, Space, Material, and National Identity, and Not Berlin, Not Shanghai, Art Practice on the Periphery, edited with Mana Sheeran. Einfeldt holds a Ph.D. in art history from the University of Hamburg, and her dissertation was Landscape, Material, and National Identity, Art and Public Space in Mexico, 1950 to 84. I welcome her on stage.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you very much, Emilia, for organizing the Encuentros Symposium so carefully. And special thanks to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art and the Terra Foundation for making this possible. I will speak in my contribution about the relations and interactions between US photography and Mexican landscape painting in the late 19th century, considering the role of both in the forging of the official discourse on national identity in Mexico. The main focus will lie on the study of two of its key representatives, who are Mexican landscape painter José María Velasco. We already saw some works of his in Catherine Manshorn's presentation today earlier, and US pioneer photographer William Henry Jackson, coming to some comparative conclusions at the end of the paper. When visitors entered the Mexican Pavilion at the International Exhibition in Paris in 1889, they found themselves confronted with the vast imaginary realm of the Mexican. Natural products, architectural and industrial exhibits, as well as anthropological objects and their replicas, joined contemporary oil paintings and photographs of Mexico's countryside and inhabitants. The so-called Aztec Palace showed a vision of Mexico that in many ways has persisted in the worldwide collective memory ever since. The Mexican contribution to the fair, commissioned by the Ministry of Urban Renewal, was conceived as a demonstration of Mexico's modernity and the current Mexican national style. It was also supposed to be an ephemeral monument to President Porfirio Díaz and his politics of identity. Going back to different pre-Columbian architectural elements, the Aztec Palace brought the state of art and identity in Mexico to the fore. The friezes of the staircase pillars showed ornament variants of the Mixtec ceremonial center of Mitla. The two caryatides at the entrance were, according to architect Antonio Peñafiel, true reconstructions of the Atlantis de Tula, combined with classical Greek elements. At the place of the tympanum at Greek-Roman temples, a relief of the so-called Aztec calendar stone was installed above the porch, crowned by the Mexican flag. The aim of the builders of the Aztec Palace was to establish Mexican art at eye level with late 19th century historism in Europe. Interestingly, the successful Mexican landscape painter José María Velasco had been named commissioner of the pavilion's fine art section by the Minister of Urban Renewal, enclosing 5 sections: paintings and watercolors, diverse paintings and drawings, sculpture and medallion engravings, architecture, engravings, and lithographs. Among the 102 oil paintings, 68 were works by Velasco. Of the 23 categorized as diverse paintings and drawings, 19 were by him. In the oil paintings by Velasco and other artists, the landscape and history of the young republic took center stage. One of Velasco's central pieces in the pavilion was his acclaimed Valley of Mexico from 1877. A wide panorama from the perspective of the hill of Santa Isabel shows the deep valley of Mexico with the Texcoco Lake in the east and the characteristic mountain silhouette in the south. The snow-covered volcanoes Popocatépetl and Ixtaccíhuatl in the background, as well as the prominent nopal cactus and the flying eagle in the foreground, reveal Velasco's artistic approach, combining naturalist geographical and botanical components with references to Mexican mythology and national symbols. Velasco had a deep interest in natural sciences, researching in the fields of botany and geology, and the artistic approach he developed became central to the national style and official discourse of national identity of his time. The urge for a national style in Mexico had come up in the 1860s, alongside the liberal reforms of that time. Painting and sculpture in Mexico at the time were based on the French Beaux-Arts tradition being taught at the Academy of San Carlos, which has been founded in 1781. The lack of originality of such work became the subject of liberal criticism. The leading liberal intellectual, Ignacio Manuel Altamirano, called for a conflation of nationalism and progress in the arts that might result in a Mexican national style. Quote, "Why have so many young people with real artistic qualities not tried to create a school of painting and sculpture that is essentially national, modern, and in harmony with the incomparable progress of the 19th century?" Velasco was the artist of his time who most fully realized Altamirano's vision. The Mexican contribution to the Paris 1889 fair, with its range of plein-air paintings by Velasco, demonstrated the state of a national style in Mexico, and especially of the state of landscape painting. It also offered a path to modernity for a country that was in the middle of a modernization process. Velasco described the exhibition at the Mexican Pavilion as a brilliant success in a letter to his family in June 1889. He also referred to an article by French critic Léon Cahin as praising his work. Cahin had pointed out the Mexicanness of Velasco's landscape paintings and the uniqueness of his style. Quote, "There is a landscape school in Mexico, and a school that doesn't owe anything to anybody, that is not imitating anybody, that has developed by itself." At the same time, Cahin carved out the exotic as a crucial element in Mexican landscape painting and its specific national characteristics. Quote, "A taste for the exotic in its beautiful natural scenes, the views that are everywhere, like the snow-covered Popocatépetl and the peak of Orizaba, which represent in the paintings the same role as that of the Fujiyama in Japanese drawings and the Vesuvius in Neapolitan paintings." With this evaluation, Cahin labeled Velasco internationally a major representative of the current Mexican style, one founded on its local resources and independent from European isms. Altamirano's call for a self-reliant modern national style in Mexico seemed to have been fulfilled. The state of Mexico's development in Velasco's Valley of Mexico is demonstrated by certain elements of his composition. In the center of the painting, one of the main transportation accesses of the city reveals the transformed nature of the once virgin landscape of the Anahuac Valley, once virgin landscape of the Anahuac Valley. It demonstrates the domestication of nature by industrialization and technical progress. This tendency to highlight the industrialization of the landscape becomes even clearer in paintings such as Curved Bridge of the Mexican Railway at the Matlack Canyon from 1889 by Velasco, which depicts one of Mexico's achievements in engineering of the time. An impressive railway bridge crossing the broad Matlack Valley on 8 double pylons made of steel. The train, with its widely visible clouds of steam as a reference to speed and technological achievement, crosses the tropical valley. The landscape's exoticism is highlighted by naturalistic depictions of huge ferns and tropical plants. In this way, Velasco created paintings of progress. At the same time as Mauricio Tenorio Trillo characterized the Mexican contribution to the Paris Fair, he created, quote, "a portable image of the exotic for the national and international consumption." Beyond the paintings, watercolors, drawings, sculptures, medallion engravings, and lithographs, It was the photography, the most modern medium of the time, that stood out in Peñafiel's and de Anza's Aztec Palace. The contemporary photographs on view notably included a series commissioned by the Ministry of Development, depicting the railroad line that ran from Mexico City to Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, as well as 34 photographs of Mexican landscapes. Among the 34 landscape photographs which had been commissioned by the National Railroad of Mexico, several images by US photography pioneer William Henry Jackson stand out. It appears that Jackson worked and traveled in Mexico at least 3 times. I have to say at this moment, we have actually very little confirmed information about Jackson's Mexican work periods, and therefore further research in US and Mexican archives has to be done. In 1882-1883, Jackson travels to Mexico for the first time. Again in 1883, 1884, and for the last time in 1891 or 1893, working on the Mexican Railway Company's commission for publicity photos for its newly opened railway lines. The American photographer, known since the 1870s as the great photographer of the West, traveled alone and during his second trip to Mexico in company of his family and friends on different railway lines. Jackson's first commission in 1882-1883 was intended to take images of the so-called Mexican Central North-South Railway Line, one of the country's key railway lines, to be inaugurated in 1884. And running from the border town of Ciudad Juárez to Mexico City, passing the cities of Chihuahua, Aguascalientes, and Querétaro. So here you see the line starting in Ciudad Juárez, running down to Mexico City, I think it's about here. The line which linked El Paso to the Santa Fe Railroad had been realized thanks to substantial technical and financial support from the United States towards Porfirio Díaz's modernization program. Besides the commission of the new railway lines, this program turned the country toward a more efficient, though socially oppressing, hacienda system that Jackson depicted in his images of the railway lines as well. During his second and third professional trip to Mexico, Jackson documented the recently inaugurated southern line, the Ferrocarril Transístmico, connecting the cities of Salina Cruz, Tehuantepec, and Oaxaca. So this is the line to Oaxaca, and this is the line going down to Tehuantepec and Salina Cruz. Jackson took for his Mexican commissions more than 500 pictures, which are today part of the Detroit Publishing Company collection in the prints and photograph section of the Library of Congress here in Washington. They primarily depict Mexican landscapes defined by railroad tracks and trains as requested by his commissions. As in earlier documentations for his US commissioners, such as the Union Pacific Railroad, the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, Jackson chose the most exciting aspects of the landscape to depict the achievements of the Mexican Railway Company. The photographs of the Temasopa River Canyon in San Luis Potosí, for example, show the rough, stony canyon and tunnels that had to be excavated by the Mexican Railway Company in order to make way for the trains running north-south and vice versa through the country. The train that we see here travels along the tracks on the embankment, high above the canyon, emanating steam and displaying the industrial qualities of power and speed, prominent since William Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western from 1844. In the Temasopa depictions, Jackson followed his deep interest in geological and other natural phenomena. His first photographic works had been discovered by geologist Ferdinand Hayden, who invited him to work together in the framework of the 1870 US government survey for the Yellowstone River and Rocky Mountains, which became a groundbreaking commission for Jackson's career. After this project that led to the foundation of the Yellowstone National Park as the first national park of the United States, Jackson developed his photography further and became worldwide famous for his work on the American West. Working for the Mexican Railway Company in the 1880s and 1890s, Jackson's Mexican photographic compositions became crucial for the further development of the landscape photography and painting in the country. They also stood in line with tendencies in Mexican landscape painting between the 1870s and 1890s. During his work trips to the country, Jackson showed as well a stronger interest than before in contrasts, especially between nature and the industrial object, such as the heavy metallic locomotive. He depicted the locomotive itself prominently in photographs, such as the ones taken from a train in front of the celebrated Querétaro aqueduct, framed and contrasted by nature as nopales and other cacti. Of campesinos in a maguey field setting with a train in the background that is about to pass a newly constructed bridge. Other images concentrate on picturesque natural sites, such as several cafetales and the waterfalls from Juanacatlan in the state of Jalisco, formerly known as the Niagara of Mexico, that seem to invite travelers to come to the country to enjoy its tropical environment and scenic views. The composition of trains in front of picturesque scenery was, on the other side, prominent in Mexican landscape painting between the 1870s and 1890s as well. Besides the oeuvre of Casimiro Castro and Carlos Rivera, it was again, especially in José María Velasco's work, where analogies can be found. Coming back to Jackson's well-known Temasopa photograph, taken most probably during his second Mexican trip in 1883-1884, compositional parallels to Velasco's curved bridge of the Mexican Railway at the Metlac Canyon from 1881, one of his most acclaimed paintings at the 1889 Paris Fair, can be outlined. Both images depict modern trains of the Mexican Railway Company passing through valleys on recently inaugurated curved bridges and embankments, high above deep canyons. The parallels go even beyond compositional elements, as in both images, Velasco's painting and Jackson's photograph, the landscape is recognizable as Mexican. In Velasco's oil painting, the characteristic hills of the Metlac Valley stand out. Jackson chose a part of the Temasopa River Canyon where not only the huge stone crust of the tunneled hill, but also the characteristic central and northern Mexican cactus plants were clearly visible. Velasco, on the other hand, stresses the tropical through the realistic depiction of regional plants in the forefront of the painting. By this means, the combination of the steaming locomotive on bridges and embankments within the recently domesticated Mexican landscapes, Jackson's photographs, quote, celebrate the technologization of the wilderness and advertise its availability to tourists. Another parallel to Velasco's mise-en-scène and curved bridge of the Mexican Railway at the Metlac Canyon. Velasco himself worked frequently with photography to realize his landscape paintings from the late 1860s and 1870s on. In his study on the role of photography in Velasco's oeuvre, Mexican critic Olivier Desbrois noted that when the painter didn't use the camera for the composition of his images, he used it to observe nature in detail. As a teacher of applied perspective at the Academy of San Carlos in 1871, Velasco introduced the camera in his classes as a scientific tool for capturing views of the landscapes to be painted. This was even before the first photography class opened at the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes in 1878. Velasco's practice stood in line with a search for a national style and Altamirano's call to establish a Mexican photography. In 1868, the writer criticized Mexican photographers for their lack of interest in the landscape. Quote, there are only a few places hallowed for being famous, and this only when they are close to the capital or some big city. But the rest is unknown. It is easier to find a photographic depiction of any insignificant village in France than of the most famous places of our history. So, if one looks for a picturesque depiction of this country's landscape, what is very much needed, or to illustrate our history, there is no data available. Altamirano asked for more commitment to landscape photography, as from the 1850s to the 1880s, most photographers in Mexico were specializing in portrait photography after graduating from the academy. Not to mention the use of the new medium was reserved mainly for traveling photographers whose images were destined for the US and European public with a specific interest in geographical and ethnological knowledge. Perhaps the most famous examples are Claude Désiré Charnay's Album Mexicano from 1859 and his album with views on Yucatec ruins. In this framework, Jackson is one of the key representatives of the late 19th century travelers' photography in Mexico, who also left notable traces in the country's photography of the time. To give an example, since the second work trip, Jackson brought mammoth plate cameras to Mexico, realizing huge glass plate negatives for the first time in the country. From the later 1880s on, the first Mexican photographers started to work with the innovative mammoth plate technique in landscape photography as well. In the detail of a photograph of a train running on the Matlock Valley Bridge, besides the employment of the new technique, Jackson's as well as Velasco's compositional focuses become recognizable. The anonymous photographer demonstrates the newest technological achievements in Mexico through the photographic technique itself, as well as through the steaming locomotive in movement and the audacious bridge framed by the valley's exotic nature. Photographs like this show how Mexican landscape painting, as well as the US pioneer photography of the late 19th century, influenced the further development of landscape photography and the official discourse on national identity and modernity in Mexico. A crucial aspect for the reception of these images as such was their display and publication. The places for which Jackson's images for the Mexican Railway Company were destined to be exhibited show that these campaigns were supposed to address travelers from abroad. The photographs were, as Jackson's US commissions, supposed to be mounted in the company's railway cars, at train stations, and on platforms, as well to be printed in travelers' information on a later stage. These strategies for display and dissemination underlined the aim to broadcast a modern image of the Mexican to an international public. I'm coming to some conclusions and back to the Aztec Palace. Representing the spirit of their time and featuring idealized images of both Mexican nature and industrialization, a kind of Mexican way to modernity, Jackson and Velasco were successful representatives of landscape painting and photography in Mexico in the 1889 Paris Fair. Their images of landscape and progress became icons of the contemporary national discourse in Mexico, featured in the eclectic Aztec Palace. Their visions stimulated the Mexican landscape photography of the late 19th century and nurtured foreigners' concepts of the exotic, forging the imaginary realm of a modern Mexicanness that partly exists even until today. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is María Gaztambide, who directs the documents of the 20th Century Latin American and Latino Art Project at the International Center for the Arts of the Americas of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. For nearly 6 years, she's actively collaborated on research, publication, and long-term exhibition initiatives at MFAH. Previously, Maria was at Tulane University, where she taught courses on Latin American art and culture and pursued an MA in art history and an interdisciplinary Ph.D. in Latin American studies. In years past, Maria conducted the Puerto Rico and New York documentation projects for the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art. I invite her on stage.
Thank you, Carmen. I am particularly interested in how in just 1.5 sessions our papers and areas of interest are particularly intertwining, and I'm particularly happy to present after Deborah Cullen and also after Edward Sullivan and Max Mishler, rather, because their papers actually provide wonderful context for my work. From 1941 to the mid-1960s, Puerto Ricans experienced what some historians have dubbed a quiet revolution. During these 2 decades, the island transitioned from a U.S. protectorate to a semi-autonomous commonwealth, shifting from an agricultural to an industrial economy. The importance of the so-called revolution is increased by the fact that with respect to means, it was not revolutionary. Rather, change occurred peacefully and through the ballot box, heralded by New Dealer Rexford Guy Tugwell, who was Puerto Rico's last American governor in office from 1941 to 46. The transformation was brought to fruition by Luis Muñoz Marín, the charismatic local leader who became the island's first democratically elected governor in 1948, but he took office in 49. Tugwell and Muñoz Marín fast-tracked arts programs that helped to convert Puerto Rico's disenfranchised urban classes and rural masses into democratic and civically empowered citizens capable of fueling economic transformation. This paper centers on two seminal collaborative experiments in Puerto Rico that, in the spirit of the New Deal, established the infrastructure for a vigorous national arts movement in the island. And these programs are the photo file at the Governor's Office of Information, established during Tugwell's administration, and then the Division of Film and Graphics within the island's Commission of Parks and Recreation, established under Muñoz Marín and in existence from 1946 to 49. Ultimately, both of these experimental programs paved the way for the 1949 formation of the hallmark División de Educación a la Comunidad, or DIVETCO, which served as a learning ground for much of Puerto Rico's 1950s generation of artists. And it's perhaps the program that most of us know best. The photo file of the Farm Security Administration's historical section had an underlying cohesion, a deeply rooted concern for what was happening in the United States in the 1930s. Edwin Roscom, the photographer who served as editor of the historical section's photo file and coordinated the exhibitions for the unit, summarized it in this way. One thing that made the file what it was is that it had a certain underlying passion. These people, all of them, shared this to different degrees. They had an impatience and an anger with the poverty that they found around, a concern with the people who did not have what they should have. This gave the whole thing equality, and of course he's talking about the famous photographers that were ascribed to the photo file, including obviously Dorothea Lange and some other important photographers as well, including Jack Delano, who I'm going to discuss more in detail in this paper. Edwin and Louise Roscom first went to Puerto Rico in 1937 on a freelance assignment for life to investigate the Palm Sunday massacre in the southern city of Ponce. On March 21st, 1937, members of the Insular Police had shot and killed 17 unarmed members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party and wounded several hundred other civilians who had gathered for a peaceful parade commemorating the centennial of the abolition of slavery in the island and in protest of the incarceration in an Atlanta federal prison of the nationalist leader Pedro Albizu Campos. The Roscoms arrived in Puerto Rico in December 1937 in the midst of the trials against the surviving nationalists. They spent the months of December 1937 and January 1938 attending many of the hearings, and here I'm just showing you a shot of the audience of the hearings and photographing the families of some of the victims in the massacre, and that's the image that is below. And both of these are in the Library of Congress's Prints and Photographs Division here in DC. The visual reportage that the Roscoms produced was a highly critical evaluation of the United States' position in Puerto Rico at that time, Edwin Roscom recalled. And not surprisingly, Life did not publish the article. Oh boy, did Life not like it, remembered Edwin years later. Among other things, it foretold of the election of Muñoz, which was already pretty clear to anyone on the inside, and Life did not like that at all. Above and beyond the work they shot for Life, the Roscoms made the most of their time during this early trip to Puerto Rico. With Luis by his side, Edwin produced a body of photographs whose haunting beauty exudes from the careful way in which he framed his compositions, seen, for instance, in the delicate grace of the cane cutter's movements in this image, cutting cane on a sugar plantation near Ponce, shot in January of 38. Or from the careful attention that he paid to the seemingly inconsequential acts of his marginal subjects, such as this cane cutter and the way that he gracefully has that sip of water with the drops coming down, and you can actually see that. Moreover, his work from this period also reflects a great deal of empathy for the island's disenfranchised populations. As in the photograph, Funeral of a Child, also shot in Ponce, January 38, and Home Worker in the so-called needlework industry, both again shot in Ponce at that time. In November of 1941, 4 years after the Roscombs traveled to Puerto Rico, Roy E. Stryker, head of the FSA's photophile and Tugwell's former collaborator at Columbia, sent photographer Jack Delano on a 3-month assignment to the island and also to neighboring St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. I was fascinated and disturbed by so much of what I saw, Delano wrote of his first impressions of Puerto Rico. Layers of lush blue-green mountains in the distance, barefoot children running along the roadside, vast sugarcane fields bustling with sweat-drenched men swinging machetes, humpbacked zebu oxen hauling cane to the sugar mills, thatch roof huts of poor farmers roasting under the blazing sun, and the horrendous slums festering in the towns and cities. I had seen plenty of poverty during my travels in the Deep South, he wrote, but never anything like this. Yet he marveled at the dignity, generosity, and goodwill of the Puerto Ricans. On an interview with Richard Dowd for the Archives of American Art, the artist explained the holistic philosophy that Roy Stryker transmitted to FSAA photographers when approaching a new assignment, and he recalled that Roy felt it wasn't enough to photograph an FSAA project, but everything that had to do with the conditions in this particular county that made it necessary for farm security to come in and do this kind of job. Everything that went before, the possibilities of what would come after, what kind of people live in this place, why they need farm security here, what made the people the way they are. Informed by Stryker's approach, Jack and his wife Irene combed through Puerto Rico's deepest crevices, its infamous slums, and I'm showing you an image of, it's an area of San Juan that was called El Fanguito, and everyone remembers it to this day, but it no longer exists, and it's basically houses that were built on stilts over this just sort of marshy area where a lot of waste from the city actually drained to. Infamous slums and mountainous villages. He photographed school children, and this is a particularly compelling image that many of us from Puerto Rico hold it very dear. Tobacco farmers, sugarcane workers, the island's landless peasants and garment workers, as well as the recipients of farm security seed money, for example, this couple, and the recently built federal housing projects that were springing up across the island. So these last two examples are actually examples of his sort of official work, but the previous examples are the sort of more compelling human interest subjects that still fascinates us to this day. At a certain level, this corpus of work is most definitely a testament to the legacy of farm security in the island. However, at a deeper visceral level, the images stand independent to farm security, communicating in and by themselves issues at the very core of 1940s Puerto Rico as it struggled to adapt to changing values. One of the many contributions of Tugwell's administration in the island, with Muñoz supporting him from the Senate. Muñoz was the president of the Senate when Tugwell was governor, was the mandate to develop a photophile modeled after the one at Farm Security. The Roscombs were called in from Washington to develop this photophile. They spent about 6 months in Puerto Rico, taking photographs and organizing this file within the governor's Office of Information. Jack Delano writes in Photographic Memories, his memoir from '97, that Tugwell, having the foresight to select Roy Stryker to create the historical section of the FSAA in Washington, was well aware of the importance of establishing and maintaining a historical file in Puerto Rico. Soon after the Roscombs organized this file, they were called back to the States to finish a book project, and leadership was transferred over to Jack and Irene Delano. The result of this short-lived collaboration, and again it was active for about 3 years, was a corpus of 2,000 photographs that is, along with the Puerto Rican photographs of farm security taken by Jack Delano and prior to that by Edwin Roscom on assignment for life, the most complete survey of social conditions in the island, cities, and countryside during the 40s. They mimicked, to a large extent, the photo file at Farm Security. It was, Edwin Roscom remembered in '65, a direct child of Farm Security. It was made by a man, that is Tugwell, that was instrumental in helping make the photo file with the same philosophy and the same approach, with just not all the same errors we had made at Farm Security. It is not surprising that much of the surviving photographic material from the file in Puerto Rico represents a continuum with the values and overall philosophy of farm security photography. Examples from this period, including Jack Delano's sugarcane workers on their way to the mill to collect their wages of 1946, and Luis Roscom's Aguinaldo singers, both from '46, offer a sobering portrait of Puerto Rican life that is directly related to the vast corpus of documentary photography produced by Farm Security. That said, the photo file at the Governor's Office of Information also documented some key programs upon which was built the necessary infrastructure and human capital required for the drastic transformation enacted by Luis Muñoz Marin upon assuming the governorship. For instance, Luis Roscom's photograph, Land Authority Program at the Drawing of Lots for Parcelas, from November of '45, captures a woman's anxiety moments before she would learn of the outcome of a lottery through which she stood to win a parcel of land in a state-sponsored resettlement community. And just as a sort of aside, and thinking back to Sullivan and Mishler's work, by the 1940s, most of the land in Puerto Rico was owned by American big business interests. And so one of the main things that was achieved by Muñoz's government was actually the breaking up of those monopolies in favor of distributing the land among the Puerto Rican people. Notwithstanding its many flaws, these resettlement communities became the launching pads for the widely successful community development programs of the Division of Film and Graphics that I am going to discuss shortly, and after 1949, also the DIVEDCO. And I just wanted to, if you haven't had an opportunity, I think it's another great strike of luck that we have the exhibition reviewing documentary, The Photographic Life of Luis Roscom, currently on view at the museum at American University. It's on the same material, and I think it actually puts this part of my work in context. If the motor driving the photo file at the Governor's Office of Information was the need to document Puerto Rico's changing fabric in the 40s, the Division of Film and Graphics at the Commission of Parks and Recreation was conceived wholly as a pedagogical enterprise. In 1946, Senate President Muñoz Marin summoned Jack and Irene Delano and Edwin Roscom to discuss the establishment of a community education program in the island. Jack Delano recalls how Muñoz and his wife, Doña Inés, expressed their deep concern for the sad state of the educational system in Puerto Rico. Illiteracy was extremely high, especially among the rural population. The people's knowledge of the world around them came almost entirely from the radio. Those few who could read and write had no more than a third-grade education. As Muñoz put it to us, even if we use the entire island's budget for traditional methods of education, the effect would hardly be noticeable. We must invent something new, a new way of teaching. After many such meetings, he continues, the idea was born to create a new government agency that would use films, photographs, posters, profusely illustrated booklets as educational materials to help people organize, to solve some of their local problems without expecting the government to do everything for them. The Roscoms and the Delanos not only provided technical know-how and experience, but more importantly, some of the division's core values. Edwin Roscom, for example, understood from the onset that in order to enact the sort of transformation that Muñoz envisioned for Puerto Rico, islanders needed to have basic knowledge about themselves and their circumstances. Also, as the brainstorming sessions progressed, it soon became apparent that film and visual materials would be developed in order to effectively reach a largely illiterate population. Roscoe wrote in the proposal for the division, and the document is called Program of People's Education and Information, which he submitted to the Puerto Rican Senate, that the program was conceived as an interchange of ideas and facts between a people and their government. With the lessons learned from the successes and failures of WPA and farm security programs in the mainland, Roscoe's proposal contemplated the need for the division to serve the immediate needs of the communities that it served, and to address these needs promptly and efficiently. The division he envisioned should have the freedom to act independently and to uphold its programmatic and philosophical tenets. Moreover, the program required the authority to eschew the sorts of bureaucratic obstacles that had impeded the flourishing of WPA community development programs in the United States. The proposal also outlined how each of the program's 3 units, and there was a film production unit headed by Jack Delano, a graphics workshop headed by Irene Delano, and an editorial unit, which was Edwin Roscoe's part of the enterprise, would have absolute creative freedom in interpreting the main pedagogical themes that were developed. In this regard, Roscoe, who would later serve as the director for the entire enterprise as well, wrote of the need for a holistic approach requiring that all units develop materials on each of the selected themes. That is to say that for any given theme, there would be a film produced, posters and other visual materials printed, and a pamphlet or book published, all on the same issues. Finally, departing from New Deal antecedents in the United States, the proposal underscored the absolute requirement to work interactively with the community in uncovering the problems that needed attention, and subsequently in producing educational materials that would be specific to these problems. Once the division took shape, its participants understood the urgency of Muñoz's initial call to action, that the division was ascribed to the Commission of Parks and Recreation was circumstantial. The agency already had and operated a fleet of jeeps equipped with portable generators, projectors, and screens, and this is an example of one of them, that were used for showing films in baseball parks across the island. Likewise, the poster became the preferred medium for Irene Delano and her graphics workshop. Its immediacy, potential for mass reproduction, and the relative speed at which new work could be produced were all factors influencing this decision. In a 1973 interview with Puerto Rican art historian Teresa Tio, Irene Delano thought about the hastened rhythm of production of the division's graphics workshop. The poster is a medium through which to say now, she said, on the poster's capacity to convey an urgent message to a population battling some very fundamental social ills. As a rule, and I wanted to just sort of focus on the graphics division since focusing on the entire unit would be beyond the time that we have. But conceptually, they were run in a very similar manner. As a rule, they used used the least amount of color possible, 4 colors at a maximum, as well as deliberately oversimplified the planes and surfaces for added expediency during the printing process. Like the posters of the WPA before them, the graphic work of the division relied on an overemphasis on the human figure, and its often monumentalized proportions dominated the work's overall scale and composition. Emphasis was on the message, with the purely aesthetic elements on second place, Irene Delano recalled in 1973. This underlying philosophy is evident in many of the posters that she designed for the division at Parks and Recreation, and this is just one example. This is the poster Jesus de Piñero from 1946-47, which is the first in a long line of posters announcing the films produced by the cinema division headed by Jack Delano, a tradition that would carry over to the Divetco after '49. And I just wanted to also show how the posters were used because they were pasted onto the community walls. And it actually is interesting because the community residents actually awarded these works quite a bit of aesthetic value. And it's interesting to me because in many interviews with Irene Delano and other members of the graphics section of the enterprise, they said that in many occasions they had to downplay the aesthetics of the posters in order to transmit the message. And so it's ironic that the residents of the communities would actually ascribe that value back to the posters. Here, a procession of peasants carries an image of Piñero, who was Puerto Rico's first native-born governor, but he was still an appointed governor, as opposed to Muñoz, who was an elected governor, on their shoulders as if to convey their full support. As a visual resource, the merging of the politician and his people is indicative of a strong ideological weight that is very much tied to Puerto Rico's fateful leap into democracy with its first election in '48. Irene Delano's Hacia Mejores Viviendas, Towards Better Housing, on your left, and Deportes para Todos on your right, Sports for All, are two examples that draw on the poster's potential as a tool for government propaganda. The former, which features a worker laying the finishing touches on a yellow urban housing development as it fades into a mass of traditional housing in the background, announces that the insular government, and this is the text down here, the insular government has built 31 low-income housing developments since '41 to accommodate over 32,000 people, and that the construction of even more developments is underway. Deportes para Todos, on the right, depicts a man and a group of boys all clad in sports gear, advising the population to avail themselves of the sports and recreation facilities that their government offered for their well-being. Indeed, modernity demanded that the population quickly abandon its recent agrarian past, conveyed in the housing in the background, to become an urban labor force that had the right to decent housing and increased quality of life through sports programs. Edwin Roscom, who, like Jack and Irene Delano, had trained as a painter at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, again another connection to a previous paper, himself designed two posters that exploit the persuasive potential of the poster. Roscom's designs are characterized by the same sort of frontality of figures whose monumentality transcends the relatively small size of the printed sheets. With the upcoming 1948 election as backdrop, his posters, this one, inscríbase, el voto es un derecho, votar es un deber, which means register. The vote is a right, and voting is a duty. And here, el voto es la herramienta con la que hacemos nuestro gobierno. The vote is a tool through which we construct our government, represent the sort of empowered citizens to which all civic-minded Puerto Ricans should aspire. Indeed, the man in Inscríbase on your left has taken an important first step in exercising his right and duty to vote, and demands that his fellow Puerto Ricans join him in registering. Likewise, in El Voto, on the right, Roscom transmits a similar core value. The vote is the tool with which we make our government through the interplay between text and image. In this case, he establishes a connection between the agricultural tools of the workers and the political one mentioned in the slogan. Roscom brings to the fore the division's politicized agenda precisely during the key months before the election of Muñoz Marín. Another major concern for this precursory graphics workshop at Parks and Recreation were hygiene and public health issues. Posters such as Peligro, this one on the right, and Defiéndalos on the left, as well, and I'll return to these in a second, as well as Combata las Enfermedades by the American Robert Guathmy, who was a social realist here in the States, best remembered for his unromanticized pictures of African Americans. He actually went to San Juan to participate for 3 months in the division. He was invited by Irene Delano and spent three months working as a mentor and teacher to the artists in the workshop. And so he created a number of posters for the division. This is just one of them. address this interest in hygiene and public health issues. Guathmi's bitonal print instructs the population to boil their water before drinking it. Exceedingly Spartan, it reflects the division's interest in privileging the message over the poster's aesthetic possibilities. Irene Delano's posters are equally frugal in their use of aesthetic resources. However, like Guathmi's work, the intention behind them is to communicate a basic message to a largely illiterate population. As the woman passes a bar of soap and a bowl to a girl reaching for them, in this example, Defiéndalos urges viewers to wash their hands before eating, since filth leads to disease. Lo sucio causa enfermedades. In peligro, or caution, or actually danger on the right, and this poster is actually unusual in that it does not feature a human form. Delano monumentalizes a insignificant fly for added impact. Caution, it states in bright red, a fly brings germs and warns against the contraction of disease through the proper disposal and storage of waste and food. When Luis Muñoz Marín finally took office in 1949 as the first ever elected governor of Puerto Rico, the resources and manpower of the division at the at Parks and Recreation were transferred over to the Department of Education for the establishment of the DIVETCO, which was a much larger, better funded program, which is in fact the one that we best remember today. Like the arts programs of the New Deal, the photo file at the Governor's Office of Information and the experimental division of film and graphics at the Commission of Parks and Recreation were inspired by the principles of democracy and of more abundant and better life, and of a better life for all. Speaking before the annual convention of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in 1956, Governor Muñoz Marín reminisced how, through the years of Puerto Rico's struggle with its many and difficult problems, we have been learning more and more completely the lesson that no matter how good and great your friends, the vanquishing of a people's problems must depend basically on their own character, on their own will, on their own respect for themselves and for their freedom as members of civilized society, and their own ability to fruitfully organize for freedom. Unquestionably, the dedicated group of Americans, and I'm referring, of course, to Edwin and Louise Roscom and Irene and Jack Delano, who brought these programs to fruition, shared a commitment to these very values, much in the same way that the New Deal empowered Americans to reconstruct the country here in the States. The Puerto Rican art projects of the 1940s were crucial in the attainment of the government's ultimate goal of increased civic mindedness through the building of community. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Itala Schmelz, who earned her BA in philosophy at the National University of Mexico. Her essays about contemporary art have been published in several magazines and newspapers, as well as innumerable art books, both in Mexico and abroad. She was the director of the Sala de Arte Público Siqueiros in Mexico City from 2001 to 2007, where she initiated a program with guest artists and also developed exhibitions about Siqueiros' legacy. She was also the director of the first Mexican science fiction film festival, El Futuro Más Acá, which has traveled to venues around the world. In May 2007, she was appointed director of the Museo de Arte de Carrillo in Mexico City. Her most recent exhibition, Siqueiros, Landscape Painter, featured more than 75 landscapes by the Mexican muralist. She will be followed by our discussant, Michelle Greet, who is Associate Professor of Art History at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. She received her Ph.D. in Modern Latin American Art from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York University in 2004. Her book, Beyond National Identity, Pictorial Indigenism as a Modernist Strategy in Andean Art, 1920 to 1960, came out with Penn University Press's Refiguring Modernism series in 2009. And she was funded by the Getty Foundation publication grant. In 2008 to 2009, she received a research fellowship from the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. to begin work on a new book book on Latin American artists in Paris between the two world wars. She spent the summer in Paris, funded by George Mason University's Creative Award, where she conducted extensive archival research for this project. I welcome Itala on stage.
Hi, I'm glad and excited to be here. Thank you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Terra Foundation. Well, among the figures in Mexican culture of the first half of the 20th century, Luis Márquez Román, 1899-1978, is lesser known but extremely productive, versatile, and also controversial personality. As photographer, he engaged in several genders, from the anthropological documentary to modernist experimentation, with a very exaggerated and often tacky or sentimental style. He traveled throughout Mexico, building up a comprehensive photographic record of the different indigenous groups and acquiring an important collection of traditional costumes and other objects of Mexican folk and popular culture. His photographs were reproduced on postcards and stamps, travel posters, almanacs, and calendars. Marquez is also an important link in the history of the golden age of Mexican cinema. Few people know that in 1931 he was part of Sergei Eisenstein's crew and in the shooting of Que Viva Mexico. And 2 years later, he worked as scriptwriter in the film Janitzio with the young actor Emilio El Indio Fernández, who was deeply affected with this first experience, guided by the expert folklorist. In this way, Márquez's work influenced the classic promotional aesthetics of Mexicanism that appeared in indispensable films of Indio Fernández like María Candelaria. The famous bucolic skies of the cinema photographer Gabriel Figueroa were also influenced by Luis Márquez's aesthetics. Márquez was, beyond doubt, the master of kitsch nationality propaganda. He dressed the mestizo and even the pale-skinned models in indigenous attire, and so made this acceptable to the urban middle class, whose attitudes to the Indians were traditionally racist. His style would inevitably degenerate from anthropological and documentary curiosity into a sentimental theatrical backdrop. Yet, while his images presented an idealized, artificial, and purified vision of the indigenous, they still remain enchanting. Between June and October 1940, Luis Márquez was invited to participate in the Mexican Pavilion at the New York World's Fair. At that moment, the cultural and economical capital of the United States, already famous for being a cosmopolitan city, was experiencing a vibrant Mexicanist scene. The epicenter of that wave of favor for everything Mexican was undeniably located in the exhibition 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, one of the most talked about exhibitions presented by the Museum of Modern Art, which had been inaugurated on May 15 of the same year. For this exhibition, more than 4,000 objects arrived by train, among which were pieces representing the pre-Hispanic culture and the colonial period, folk art, and works by the most important exponents of modern Mexican painting. Luis Márquez participated modestly in that great show. The photographs of colonial architecture were his. And so, in New York, during the spring and summer of 1940, from the most highly cultured spheres down to those of commerce and show business, the topic of the moment was Mexico. Macy's famous department store dedicated a month to the country on the other side of the Rio Grande. I'll quote from the press bulletin. In an event of importance for New Yorkers, to be known as Mexico in Manhattan, Macy's will prove, merchandise-wise, how Mexico's art may be adapted to the practical needs, uses, and tempo of life in New York. Throughout the entire store, Macy's offered goods of Mexican inspiration. Its designers and sales staff studied the exhibition at the MoMA, coming up with 5 dominant Mexi colors, from which they created more than 150 products inspired by Mexican motifs. In June 1940, an article in Vogue magazine titled "New York Goes Mexican" states, "If during the current season you should see the great ladies of New York in sizable coveys, flitting in and out of cocktail parties, carrying a chihuahua, wearing a china poblana or mustard-colored sarape, a silken rebozo, and a pair of leather huaraches, and if at the smarter sidewalk of cafes, debutees should ask for tortillas, or a snack of huachinango, a pony of tequila, or a chaser of jugo de naranja, you need register no sign of surprise, since New York, in its upper social stratum, has definitely gone Mexican." It was to this ambience of so receptive to Mexican culture, and amid the presence of a significant delegation of Mexico's intellectual and artistic milieu, that Marquez arrived, accompanied by a small group of dancers, his truck full of regional costumes, and his camera, to present himself in the Mexican Pavilion and New York World's Fair. In 1939, one of the most celebrated international exhibitions of the 20th century was staged in the suburbs of New York City. The organizers chose as its subject the world of tomorrow, and called for the newest innovations in telephony, aerodynamics, television, etc., to be exhibited there. Albert Einstein accompanied President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the inauguration ceremony and wrote a reflection for the men and women of the future, deposited in the time capsule that the Westinghouse buried deep under the site of the fair, not to be opened for 5,000 years. Faith in science and technology concealed the impetuous nature of capitalism. Big American corporations set up the most ostentatious and entertaining pavilions of the fair. In the background, behind these imposing halls, beyond the entertainment zone, were the much smaller national pavilions, one of them Mexico's. With plaster reproduction of the Aztec calendar and the pommeled serpent as exhibition design. On November 10, 1936, the President of Mexico, General Lázaro Cárdenas, received from Groven Wallen, chairman of the board of directors of the New York World's Fair, a formal invitation to participate in the international exhibition. Cárdenas set his economic minister the task of creating the Mexican Pavilion. A year later, he received a proposal from Raphael E. Bernot. It is worth quoting the central ideas of that proto-project as set forth by Bernot. Mexico Pavilion must be a copy of some of the architectural jewels of the pre-Cartesian epoch. Scale models of notable modern buildings and projects within our territory of the contemporary period are omitted, since it would be impossible to offer anything comparable to the monumental dams, bridges, etc. that exist in various places in our northern neighbor. Hence, a Mexican contingent of that nature will be of a little interest for the exhibition's visitors. One partial way of making the Mexican pavilion more, I keep the quote. One practical way of making the Mexican pavilion more interesting will be to call on the troops of dancers, folklorists, and musicians that the Public Education Ministry has set up and which were presented recently with such a success in the Palacio de Bellas Artes and at San Juan Teotihuacan. For this purpose, one day each month could be devoted to each of the states of the Mexican Republic, publicizing the regional dances, music, songs, and costumes. This idea of including traditional dancers, singers, and musicians organized by the Education Ministry is worth of note since it leads us directly to the Luis Márquez involvement in the Mexican Pavilion. Between 1924 and 1944, Márquez worked for the ministry organizing live tableaus or dances exemplifying regional traditions accompanied by talks about the indigenous work and its costumes for diplomatic or protocol events. Nevertheless, Márquez's participation in the Mexican Pavilion did not take place until the second season in 1940. In 1939, it was the Autonomous Publicity and Propaganda Department that was in charge of the design and production, coordinated by Vicente Mendiola and Mexico's Consul General in New York, Rafael de la Colina. The financial investment in the pavilion was modest and uninspired, following a very reiterative thematic script imported from the 19th century Mexican pavilions. It introduced the visitor by the way of pre-Hispanic colonial Mexico, arriving at the modern art and society, presenting the technological and social advances and progress of the country. Bernot's idea of not showing modern Mexico because of the impossibility of competing with the technological advances of the northern neighbor may not have been to the liking of General Cárdenas, who was particularly interested in promoting his 6-year plan at the futuristic fair. The Mexican Pavilion was inaugurated on May 27, 1939, several weeks behind schedule. On April 14, the Mexican Consul General was forced to write to the authorities in charge of the fair. I quote, I regret to inform you that due to a delay in the reproduction of some of the archaeological exhibits, it will be not possible to open on May 5. In spite of the delay, the opening turned out to be especially significant when the Mexican pilot Francisco Sarabia broke the world record in a direct flight from Mexico City to New York, arriving on time as a special guest to read a message of peace that President of Mexican Republic had entrusted to him in person. This brilliant entry of Mexico into the world of tomorrow was soon to be clouded by an unexpected fatal accident. Set to return 10 days later, on June 7, a few minutes after takeoff, Sarabia's aircraft went into a dive, apparently due to engine failure, and fell into the river, killing the pilot. Members of his family witnessed the moment he lost control while they were still waving goodbye to him. President Roosevelt ordered that his body be returned to Mexico in a U.S. military plane. Nevertheless, security at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City had to be reinforced due to a rumor that Sarabia's death had been the result of sabotage. The fair, in its second stage, was reopened on May 11, 1940. The mood of the fair was made tense by the Second World War, which led many European countries to cancel their participation. But a new and popular entertainment zone, the White Way, was opened, mobilizing crowds of visitors to its attractions. Shows with sexual undertones, like the Garden of Art for amateur painters, featuring nude models posing against natural backgrounds, were set up next to domestic appliances announced by fake robots. In 1940, the Mexican pavilion was handed over to Justino Fernandez, who was also working on the exhibition at MoMA. He invited Luis Márquez to participate in the pavilion's activities. During July and August, Márquez staged the dances and tableaux of the Mexican costumes and tradition that brought him special recognition in the United States. His shows of magical and eternal Mexico were to engage the fantasies and illusions of visitors to the pavilion, amounting, according to reports, to over 1 million people. The New York World's Fair also gave Luis Márquez the opportunity to take his photographic talent to a new level, when he won the first prize in the International Photograph Exhibition held at the fair. Fred Kellman Jr. of the Photographic Society of America, who was in charge of the photographic activities at the fair, wrote to Márquez that it had been a privilege to exhibit his photographs of Mexican life, and singled out for particular praise to the photo of fishermen at Janitzio entitled Patriarchs. But actually, Márquez won the competition with the series of photographs created during his walks around the fair. Taking as essential elements the regional costumes and the models brought from Mexico, in odd but fortunate combination with the modern scene of the fair, he obtained a series of beautiful and surprising plates, which a few days later were awarded prizes and unanimously acclaimed. The photos were published in New York the same year in the magazine México Moderno, and on August 18 in the Mexican newspaper Excelsior with the title Traditional Mexican Costumes in the New York Exhibition. It is worth transcribing some of the captions. An authentic Tehuana dancing at the foot of the monument, the 4 victories of peace, with the sphere and the trilon in the background. Chiapanecan Indian beside one of the beautiful fountains, the Southern Mexican wearing the attire and holding the baton of the native governors of Chiapas is resting. I'm sorry. This is the authentic Tehuana dancing at the foot of the monument, the 4 victories of peace. No? And this is the Chiapanecan Indian beside one of the beautiful fountains. The Southern Mexican wearing the attire and holding the baton of the native governors of Chiapas is resting. And old-time China Poblana wearing an exact copy of an authentic costume from Puebla poses with a Yankee Marine who is rubbing the stomach of a Buddha and training him to intensify the stream of sympathy between Mexico and the United States. This last photo brings us directly to an exceptional photographic session that Márquez organized with a group of sailors and his female Mexican models along the pier and among the eastern pavilion of the fair. This photographic tour was clearly a process of courtship or seduction with intriguing homosexual undertones. Márquez carefully staged photographic approach to the sailors, making them an object of desire. Young men, attracted by the gay photographer and the model dressed as genuine Mexican girls, allowed their photographs be taken for postcards, arousing Western fantasies about exotic culture. This image expressed an erotic curiosity barely distinguished by the cultural pastiche produced by the photographer. In April 1914, Cárdenas received an invitation from General Motors Corporation to visit their pavilion. The letter said, "The exhibit itself portrays one possible development of the highways in the future and is an expression of our belief that very important progress must take place in this file within a relatively short space of time. The Mexican president never visited the fair, but on September 16, a delegation of distinguished politicians and representatives of Mexican culture, among whom Marquez may have been present, visited the great diorama Highways and Horizons. Filled with skyscrapers crisscrossed by broad avenues, superhighways, and bridges, which automobiles circulating at high speed. Cars and freeways were the principal key to the future. Mexican diplomats and U.S. authorities, worried by the tensions that Mexican oil for Mexican diplomats and U.S. authorities worried by the tensions that Mexican oil expropriation had sparked, the fact that the great Pan American highway had been complete from Laredo to Mexico City was the best indication of goodwill between neighbors, since it will bring progress and trade links in its wake. In the Mexican pavilion, a text ran through the building promoting the Pan American Superhighway project destined to cross the entire continent. I quote the text. "All along the route, the tourist will find breathtaking sceneries, archaeological sites, attractive cities, virgin coasts. Mexico presented itself as a stop-off point on the highway and cheaper than any other destination. Pamphlets from Pullman were handed out featuring bucolic and picturesque image with the slogan, 'Travel to air-conditioned Mexico.' On the back of the pamphlet, I quote, "Since Lindbergh's discovery of Romance Land in Cuernavaca, numberless artists and writers from the north have wandered across the Rio Grande and returned with pictures and tales about a land of dramatic scenery, quaint villages with a charm of the whole old world, great metropolitan centers, ancient pyramids, and crumbling ruins. The promotion of cars and the modern highway, hand in hand with the development of the tourist industry, create a great interest among U.S. corporations. President Roosevelt's policy of approachment toward Latin American nations, especially during the years of the Second World War, promoted all that Mexicanists favor that New York was experiencing, without completely dissimulating America's imperialist might. We should not forget that Rockefeller, president and chairman of the MoMA and a great promoter of the exhibition 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, was also Federal Commissioner for Inter-American Relations in President Roosevelt's cabinet, not to mention the fact that the fortune of his prestigious family came from oil. In this context, Marquez was a key player since he knew how to apply the aesthetics of Mexican prototypes to the needs of commercial advertising. He worked for the automobile and tourist sectors all his life. With Compañía Oller Euskadi, a leading producer of tires, he designed a brochure devoted to the Mexican indigenous weddings for the promotional series Conozca Mexico. He also produced many pamphlets and tourist postcards during the 30s and 40s, and published in magazines like Mapa or El Automóvil en Mexico. He designed ads for the Ford Motor Company, such as a photo of a Tehuana posing on an automobile. Within 1946 and 1947, he published in the Mexican magazine Hoy titles like Puebla, City of Dreams, Janitzio, The Emerald of the Lake, and Tehuantepec, Land of Legend. Márquez images presented an artificial and purified vision of the indigenous. As Pérez Montfort states, an indigenous and mestizo Mexico discovered and displayed mainly for foreign and commercial consumption, in which native dress, geographies, ethnic types, dance, costumes, and attitudes were stressed, rapidly entering the universe of typical Mexican. Márquez belonged to the generation of important folklorists and anthropologists who studied and dignified indigenous culture and Mexican folk art, and deserve the credit for having opened up a whole file of study of a rich popular culture, a culture that in the 19th century was not merely ignored, but actually despised. At the same time, their anthropological interest opened the door to tourism, which in turn led to the exploitation of the native culture, pollution of the natural paradise, and in the end, falsifying the authentic and turning it into a spectacle. The New York World Fair showed an unexpected effectiveness regarding the behaviorist and programmatic adaptation of the human will. During the planning of the fair, an advertising agency was contracted to codify the laws of human reaction of Mr. and Mrs. Consumer. The result was a success. The multitudes entering its gates were ready to psych out the reasons they suddenly yearned for television sets, superhighways, foreign foods, and streamlined life. When advertising is effective, it implants itself in the consumer's fantasies in a penetrating manner. In this sense, the fair was so effective that it introduced into the population the desire for a future way of life, subliminally oriented towards consumerism. And as regards the enthusiasm for everything Mexican, the vogue prevailing in the New York intellectual and artistic spheres when Marquez arrived continued to grow after the initial period of wonder and exaltation of the 20s, with the presence there of Clemente Orozco, Alfaro Siqueiros, Diego Rivera, and Frida Kahlo. It was this and other artists who paved the way to the taste for the exotic that stimulates the imagination of the city reaching for the sky. But by 1940, exoticism has become simply a model for commercial exploitation. I want to point out that the work of the Mexican photographer relates closely to the contemporary utopia of progress staged by the New York Fair. Both iconographies, the futurist gadgets and dioramas from the New York Fair, and Marquez Mexican types are imaginary constructs designed for publicity. One projected toward tomorrow, the future, the other seeking a native origin, the past. In Marquez images, one becomes aware of the dialectical relationship between them. His photos at the fair give us a very peculiar insight, a glimpse of something totally absent from the official records. Against the gigantic backdrop of the future, he established an intriguing and amusing aesthetic relationship, and without apparent conflict, transformed these irreducible opposites into a cultural syncretism. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carmen, for that earlier introduction. I just have a brief synthesis, and then we'll launch into discussions. It was with great pleasure that I read the papers in today's two sessions. While the sessions were divided into two separate panels, New Approaches, Latin American Art and Its Intersections, and the second panel, National Identities and International Relations, I was struck by the many parallels across sessions as well. What I thought I'd do here today is comment on some of the broader themes that emerged, engaging ideas presented by the speakers and raising areas for further inquiry. After presenting some synthesis, I'll open the floor for discussion among panelists as well as questions from the audience. The first group of papers sets out to establish intellectual frameworks, proposing new ways of approaching artistic exchange between the Americas. Whereas Catherine Manthorn offers a comparative visual approach, identifying affinities between thematically similar images from North and South America, Deborah Cullen focuses on the idea of contact zones. In pinpointing the location and circumstances of artistic links, Cullen examines just how artists came together to create alternative spaces for artistic exchange in the absence of official government-sponsored venues. Significantly, whereas artists from the United States spearheaded some of these groups, Latin American artists established others, such as the Siqueiros Experimental Workshop, indicating the unconventional leadership dynamics these zones facilitated. These human connections made in the contact zone in turn enabled continued artistic innovation after the groups were dispersed. Carmen Ramos's paper interrogates the conceptual category of Latino art, asking how curators and scholars should deploy, modify, or challenge this classification. Ramos points out Chicano and Latino art's often marginalized position as a subcategory of art of the United States. Her case study of Luis Jimenez's recasting of pop art from a Chicano perspective serves as a model for rectifying this absence of representation. Although different in approach, these papers all offer strategies to unravel the complicated issues of influence, emulation, and affinity in the context of an at times even uneven intercultural exchange. One of the first things that caught my attention when reading the second group of papers on the theme of national identities and international relations was the prominence of photography as a topic of inquiry. Perhaps because of the nature of photographic commissions, or perhaps because of the facility with which the photographer can travel with his or her tools of the trade, the photograph becomes a particularly poignant tool for presenting an official vision of national identity to foreign audiences. Two of the papers examine the role of photography in the context of international exhibitions or world's fairs. In her paper, Kirsten Einfeldt looks at how the North American photographer, William Henry Jackson, presented a selective vision of Mexico to a predominantly European audience at the 1889 International Exhibition in Paris. And Itala Schmelz examines the photographic production of Luis Márquez Romay in the context of the 1939-1940 World's Fair in New York. As a destination for travelers, these large international exhibitions, which functioned outside the traditional museum or gallery format, demand a different kind of imagery. These papers raise questions about the types of imagery deemed national, the expectations of tourists and foreign audiences, and just who the main protagonists were in constructing these images. I would be interested to hear more about the implications of highlighting the work of a North American photographer to construct a Mexican national identity at the International Exhibition in Paris, for example. In other words, does the artist's national identity impact the perceived authenticity of his or her vision of a different place? These papers bring to the fore the nuances of context and medium, as well as the complexities of audience expectations in the photographic presentation of national identity. María Gaztambide's paper on exporting the New Deal to the tropics expands on this examination of photography, taking a comparative vision of public arts programs in the United States and Puerto Rico. Her paper again brings up the intersection between the demands of documentary photography and aesthetic vision. By looking closely at the role governments play in both facilitating and shaping arts programs, she reveals how artists obtained a degree of flexibility in interpreting government mandate. For Gaztambide, documentary photography in Puerto Rico played a pivotal role in promoting and enforcing the principles of democracy. Some of the papers also intersect in their discussion of José María Velasco and the Mexican landscape. I was particularly struck with the predominance of railway imagery in Einfeldt, Schmelz, and Manthorn's paper. Indeed, railroad travel in the 19th century issued in a previously inconceivable level of national connectedness. while the railroad, with the railroad, vantage point and directionality take on greater meaning in the presentation of landscape. These images raise questions about travel and tourism, as well as the agency of the artist in selecting the most characteristic landscape vistas as distinguishing national images. Another theme that emerged in these and other papers was what Sullivan and Mishler aptly called conflicted affinities. In other words, how artists negotiate between the desires of their intended audience and their own cultural integrity or artistic vision. In the case of Oller, this tension between self-promotion and political consciousness plays out in very subtle ways. Particularly interesting were the author's interpretation of Oller's possible attitudes toward the US as not only an imperialist force, but also a model of abolitionism and modernization. Finally, I was struck by the recurring importance of Paris in many of these papers, and I have to admit a personal bias here since I'm currently working on a manuscript on the subject. As a locus for the 1889 International Exhibition, the site of Oller's training and long-time place to live, as well as the city where the Atelier 17 was founded, and Mata was introduced to Surrealism, and I think that comes from an earlier version of Deborah Cullen's paper, when you might talk about Mata. It seems that perhaps considering broader circuits of exchange between Latin America, Paris, and New York, or perhaps different circuits of exchange that includes Los Angeles, Chicago, or other European cities such as Madrid or Barcelona would enrich the discussion. The themes and frameworks raised in the symposium serve as an excellent model for these future inquiries. Without the intense transnational dialogues that occurred between the Americas, neither Latin America nor the art of the United States would have taken the forms it did. In recent years, art historians, like scholars in other disciplines of the humanities, have begun to focus on issues of cultural contact, colonialism, transnationalism, globalization, border cultures, and ethnic diasporas in their research and exhibition practice. By addressing zones of contact, alternative artistic spaces, and intercultural exchange, these studies ask a different set of questions than those that analyze a limited geographic region. The shift in the discipline is beginning to allow for the study of traditionally overlooked areas, many of which the papers we heard today address. These inquiries add to our understanding of artists' migrations and transnational projects in which they participated. Thank you. So what I thought we'd do then, that was my very short synthesis of some of the, we can expand on any of these themes that I brought up or bring up some questions. I guess I'll start off with a question, and then I really want to open it up to the audience. I don't want to dominate at all. So I'll start with a question, and then we'll open up from there. And so expanding on some of the themes that I just discussed, I wondered, and this is pretty much open to anyone who wants to respond, I'm wondering if we can discuss further the intersection between photography, and a lot of things here, photography, landscape, patronage, and national identity. And in photography in particular, I'm interested in or we could add in prints here, is it somehow more adaptable to transnational reception? I was wondering about the predominance of photography in some of these talks. And it's a broad question, so I was trying to get questions that could encompass a lot of the...
Okay, sorry. What I would like to point out, also to other points you addressed when you spoke about photography, the presence of the railway in landscape painting and photography of the late 19th century. We shouldn't forget that photography was one of the big innovations of the 19th century. And especially when you speak about world fairs, obviously the fairs, or every country at the fair wants to show like the state of modernity in this country. So for me, it was in a way surprising to find these photographies and to see how they are and how they work and how they are put into this frame. But I think when you think about it again, it's really logic that you have so much photography in these frameworks. Yeah.
I also think it has to do, in a much broader historical and art historical sense, with inexpensive reproductive forms. Mm-hmm. And you can think about photography in the 19th century or the early 20th century without thinking much farther back in the history of at least early modern art, where artists all throughout Europe were looking at each other's prints. And prints, for example, just think of things that I'm looking at and thinking about these days. The history of early modern Spanish painting would not be what it is without artists looking at prints by Dürer and Rubens and these very, very easily transportable things. So I think that that speaks to a constant cycle of examining reproductive forms of communication that comes about in the 19th century with photography, but had come about long before with painters responding to prints.
Also very, very portable
Portability,
products.
yeah.
I mean, another thing to keep in mind is just the development of the technology, that in other aspects of the technological development, Latin America was a bit behind in some cases, but in the case of photography, it was disseminated almost immediately. And there's a dissertation by Keith McElroy about photography in Peru, and there are other individual countries that have been covered over time. But what you begin to notice is that in so many of the countries, the railroads, of course, were hiring the photographers to photograph these projects of theirs, frequently, as was mentioned, funded by outside sources, international, usually U.S. or England or outside Latin America. But then that also means that those photographs were, archived and documented and kept in one place so that we know about those things. So I mean, I think that's another reason that there's a heavy predominance of railroad imagery.
Yeah, I just want to point out that even though the photography or cinema were very important for Mexican identity, in fact, it was the paintings, the painters, the Mexican muralists who create this symbolic image of Mexico. The national identity, the construction was made especially in painting, not in, well, also in photography and cinema, but painting was the place where the symbolic construction of Mexicanism was the main construction.
Shall we open up for questions? I see one already.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. I have a comment, maybe, and a question for María Gaztambide. It's interesting that you see this project of pre-Divetco, and which is very much connected to FDR, New Deal, obviously, as somewhat positivistic, like it was helping democracy, where others really have seen this as problematic in the sense that it was aiding in the creation of this propaganda, neo-colonial propaganda in Puerto Rico, and how to really take these people in the countryside and make them better citizens, quote unquote, that is, citizens of the United States, which they became in 1917. And part of this whole, my knowledge of this, when Ross come and the Delanos come, they have an agenda which it comes with, and they have an understanding that comes from their work in the United States through the WPA and et cetera. They come to Puerto Rico and they are under Luis Muñoz Marin, who has an agenda, definitely, very much a political agenda, and it's not all, let's get rid of poverty. Yes, that's the obvious thing, but it's also the construction of this new idea of a connection with the United States. It could have been another idea. So they go into the countryside, and it's a very naturalistic, naturalized kind of agenda, because alongside telling you how to, wash your hands and prevent malaria and other diseases, they're telling you how to be a good democratic citizen. That's right. And this is almost like the noble campesino. Don't be the noble savage anymore. Now you are the noble citizen.
Right,
that we can manipulate. And so I just wanted to make the point that it wasn't all rosy. It was very problematic.
No, and to transform these people into ultimately the urban working class that would fuel the economic development for the island, too.
Right. So it is democracy, quote unquote, because what happens is, of course, that you have this duality between pro-United States and then pro-Puerto Rico, which is always Muñoz Marin's dilemma. Operation Bootstrap, Operation Serenidad. Let's remain Puerto Rican, but let's be American.
And ultimately, that's why he, later on in life, many people think that his project had failed. Many people thought that he thought his project had failed.
Well, look at Puerto Rico now. It failed.
It failed.
Hi, thank you, Marvette, for that comment. I'm Laura Katzman, a professor at James Madison University, and thank you, Maria, for mentioning the exhibition I just curated at the American University Museum on Louise Roscom's work. Much of her Puerto Rico work is there, and I was very happy to see some of it up on the screen today. To kind of echo Marvette's comment, but to give you another dimension on this, I think we have to see some of the optimism of these programs in the post-war period in Puerto Rico, also against the backdrop of Cold War tensions and Cold War paranoia. And a kind of interesting footnote that needs to be elaborated on really is the Roscoms felt very much pushed out of Puerto Rico because of accusations of being communistic. And so there is this other sort of darker side to this that I think obviously a 20-minute paper can't always bring out, but I think it's important to note that. Why the Delanos were able to stay there and withstand the accusations, but the Roscoms felt pushed out is a sort of subject I've been exploring. But
I think maybe for practical reasons, the Delanos, Jack Delano was a conductor, he was involved in TV, and so they very much helped build the infrastructure for the public television in Puerto Rico, and subsequently for sort of the overarching, or I guess, a cultural infrastructure for the island. And so in that sense, that's probably what enabled them to stay on for so long.
I want to thank the panelists for today for opening up a really wonderful can of worms. I think we have different kinds of methodologies, probably because of different kinds of pressures. I was just thinking about Dr. Ramos's paper being so different, and in some ways, Deborah Collins shares some of the same kinds of challenges, that there's silences in American art history or in art history in general. And so some scholars and curators are working against that silence and bringing out new material and seeing it in other ways. And then I think some of the other panelists are just getting us to think, to borrow Catherine Manthorn's phrase, new proposals, right, for studying. But in some ways are not, those proposals can fall very gently and safely within art history proper. And so I was wondering if panelists could reflect on where they felt, because it could be just my own blinders about the field, where they felt they were really pushing against art history and its way of not seeing or allowing for these encuentros. Thank you.
I guess for me, I always think of very basic concepts. Some of them are not even concepts, but just words. Something like a word like participation. You know, when you think about art worlds and how segregated they were, and maybe or still are in some areas, you know, it complicates the notion of participation. You know, which is one way in which we think of art movements, of groups, is you know, people coming together. But in some cases, even when you're part of a movement like Luis Jimenez, you're still not viewed as a participant. So you know, I really kind of was just thinking of very, very basic concepts and trying to really redefine participation in a much broader way. You know, participating potentially from the outside, but still being part of a discussion.
Also, I think one of the methodologies that one is constantly coming up against, particularly in Latin American art, perhaps more in older art from the early 20th century, from the 19th century, is that of geographic taxonomies. This field has not been particularly, I mean, it's not a very old field, and there has been an emphasis upon considerations from a local point of view of artist X was born, did this, did this, did this, did this, did this, did this, and this, and then died. So it is this type of very, very basic taxonomy where perhaps European art was 60 or 80 years ago that still plagues some art from a number of places, and these are challenges I think all of us are keeping in mind. And in the case of somebody like Francisco Oller, a 19th century artist who has been written about almost exclusively from the point of view of what he did in a Puerto Rican context. But the point is that he was really a global artist, if you want to use that word, avant la lettre, a global artist before the word or the term was ever conceived of. And you can't look at his art without talking about his political affinities, conflicted or not, his affinities with and his insertion within a variety of art worlds, the sort of later neoclassical art world of Spain, and the Impressionism and Realism of France, and a whole plethora of ways of depicting and ways of thinking of visuality that he was connecting with vis-a-vis his contemporary Caribbean artists and even contemporary artists in the United States. And so that, I think, is something of the methodology that we all, I believe, are trying to resist and break into new areas of larger frameworks that are only possible, the only possible way for expanding this very dynamic field. And I think I've been terribly stimulated by all these papers. And I think another thing I wanted to mention, which doesn't have exactly to do with your comment, but that I've noticed in listening to these papers, is the interest in technology. And you were Michelle, talking about photography. But before this conference began, I had the great privilege of seeing the beautiful exhibition upstairs about cabinets of wonder. I don't remember exactly the title of it, but it was absolutely riveting. And it is based upon American artists responding to individual technologies, mining and lumber, the lumber industry and photography and so on and so forth. And I think interestingly, the desires and the interest of the curators of that exhibition have created very interesting synergies with the papers and the ideas that have been floating about this afternoon. So it'd be very interesting for everyone here to look at that as a model that we all could respond to in a way.
Well, I could just jump in with, we have the word participation, we have the word taxonomies, and I think another word that we might bring into the discussion is mobility. I mean, I can remember studying American art, and the only mobility that was ever mentioned was that if American artists went to Paris or if they went to Rome. I mean, we didn't look at the broader context, and so that was another issue. The idea of Oller's portrait, of McKinley traveling, objects traveling, artists traveling, but also even, things like I was mentioning the sugar roots, or people have looked at the Manila Galleon. I mean, these are other ways in which we can break out of this idea of the nation state, which after all didn't really exist until, in many cases, the 19th century anyway. And so, just thinking about other models, and I think that, to me, a lot of the papers already, and most of the papers already, and I'm anticipating more tomorrow, are each in its own way, pushing the envelope. So I'm really excited about what's going on here.
Yet at the same time, each of these papers are hindered to an extent by the need to provide context, because in your case, Oller is probably Puerto Rico's best known artist, yet many people in this audience who are specialists don't know who he is. And so you can't escape providing this vital context for your work as well. And so that maybe doesn't allow for you to push as far as you could.
In 20 minutes.
In 20 minutes, exactly. And I think we all suffer from that.
I just want to say one of the very important things to do, or at least I've always found when sort of trying to talk about these, I like to call them problematic figures, I'm really intrigued by them, is ask the other artists. If you have the opportunity to be working with living artists, I found so much out by artists, telling you, no, this is the person who is really important, and finding out things, that way through artists. So, Bob, everybody you meet knows Bob, but there really was nothing written about him. Everyone talks about Stanley William Hayter, but he's kind of like cited and a little bit overlooked. Louis Sarinal, everyone speaks about, and it just goes on and on. So it's kind of like those are the figures we need to focus on.
I'll follow up on that and just acknowledge you're giving away the curator's secret, which is to actually talk to the artist. Right? I wanted to kind of circle back around to what Carmen and Ed had been talking about, because I think when, Carmen, when you brought up the word participation, that's the one I kept writing down, and in some ways I thought it was a more useful term than, say, the critical one of contact zones. Because in a way, I think what both what you and Deborah did was to show a kind of artist-centered history in which, through their participation in various contexts, in some ways your understanding of those contexts begins to shift. And in some cases pretty dramatically in terms of the genealogy or the sequence of how a movement starts or how a period can begin. I did want to kind of come back around though, because ultimately that ends up being the go to New York historiography, which is to be in those spaces where people can interact and to intermix. And I thought that maybe going back to Catherine's point about affinities and parallels and how that term comes up, but in some ways that's a less theorized concept than that of participation. And what came to my mind is those instances in which you have something that has an affinity, that resonates with a practice, a genre, or a moment that has been recognized in the literature, and what then becomes the basis of its relationship. Is it merely something that reaffirms that prior history, or does it in some way stand in a kind of tension to it? And I was thinking of the group OSCO, which in part through some of my efforts as well as those of Ondine Chavoya and Rita Gonzalez and others, is, I think at this point, being fully kind of incorporated into the history of post-1968 avant-garde art, and very seamlessly so. And yet, as Harry Gamboa, one of the artists, said to me, upon looking at this, looking at the exhibitions and the publications, it's all very compelling. It makes a lot of sense in terms of how that period of the arts has traditionally been understood with their exclusion, but it's not necessarily what they were doing at that time. And so how do you give appropriate attention or space to what is, in some respects, a localized history in which some of the forms, some of the practices that emerge that we now recognize by name were in fact quite organic to a particular cultural and political moment. I'm thinking also of Alberto Valdez, who was essentially an outsider artist painting in Echo Park from the 40s through the 80s, producing hundreds of non-figurative works, which is not what you would expect coming out of the Mexican-American community. And again, because in some ways he was playing out a dialogue with what was happening around him, but he was not participating in that art world. And so I guess I'd be interested in that part of how do you give attention to that? What sort of kind of theorizing can one have for affinities beyond just the fact of certain similarities? And how can you bring that back to the kind of more in-depth histories that you were both in some ways kind of exemplifying in terms of tracing the different kinds of participations and the questions that raises? 20 minutes or less.
I mean, you know, everyone seems to be shrugging their shoulders, so I'll take a stab at it. Well, I think one of the ways we could perhaps do it, and I tried to hint at it, but again, the 20-minute thing is haunting us, is just the whole idea of historic figures. And so people like, I mean, I mentioned Sarmiento and Cooper, but of course I needed to bring in Jose Marti and his two Americas. You need to bring in, so I mean, I think, and of course, many other writers as well. And so you might, you know, you can use these constructs that come out of political leaders, philosophers, and align those with some of the issues that we're talking about in terms of the visual arts. I mean, of course, the United States has its own history of, you know, the Monroe Doctrine, the good neighbor policy, all these things, and all those moments, in a way, correspond to certain points in time where you can find, again, some of these kinds of, you know, points coming into dialogue. So, I mean, there are different ways of approaching it, but, you know, that's just one possibility, is historic literary figures.
You mentioned a lot of very interesting affinities between the two cultures in terms of visual arts. And I was interested also in the affinities as far as the representation of landscapes is concerned. Now, I was wondering whether there was a real contact between the two cultures, because, for example, in the United States, in the 19th century, the Hudson River School of Painting, you know, had been fostered by the transcendentalist thought. So there was a real reason for this interest in the countryside, in the landscape, in the wilderness, and also the people in the United States were discovering their country for the first time. What happened in Mexico? I don't think that there was the same attitude towards the landscape. And also, going back to the contact between the two cultures, you know, I don't think that there was a lot of contact, especially after 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I think there was a lot of tension between the two countries.
Well, of course, I mean, you're right about the Treaty of Guadalupe, you know, the war between the United States and Mexico did create certain tensions, but there were also, that also brought artists into the country. I mean, just as one example, there was the border survey, and a lot of visual artists participated in the border survey, making images of these areas. Velasco himself became known in this country. His work was exhibited at the Philadelphia at the Centennial, but I found a lot of reports in the New York Times that prior to, a lot of the material was sent from Mexico to New York and then opened in New York and then sent on to Philadelphia. So the New York Times reporting, well, Velasco's paintings have arrived, and this very well-known painter is as good as ever. You know, so they have an awareness of him. You also have to keep in mind that people like Alexander von Humboldt, he was in Mexico in 1803, and you know, he is also part of this tradition that is, you know, cycling around, that then other, you know, later people pick up on Humboldt and look at how he looked at the landscape. Velasco is aware of Humboldt. So I mean, there are many mutual sources, there are many points of contact, and certainly between the US and the United States, there are many more opportunities for this type of, you know, across the border type analysis than there are, say, between the United States and Argentina or somewhere else. I mean, so I think that, and even in some of the work that was talked about in terms of the photographs, I kept thinking of people like Thomas Moran, who was down there later. Church was down there, it was in Mexico later. So, you know, they're just we're just beginning to sort of unravel a lot of these relationships, and also figuring out not just the material to look at, but how to look at them, in reference to the other question about how do we theorize affinities and how do we theorize these dynamics. All this needs to, you know, needs a lot more attention.
I'll jump in with another question that, I mean, this is also a question for the whole panel, so anyone can jump in and answer. I'm thinking about the whole notion for the symposium, this idea of encuentros between the Americas, and I'm wondering if anyone has a notion of, is this a privileged kind of interaction between, is there something special about this trans-hemispheric encounters that is different, for example, from different types of encounters, or do we need to look at more historicized moments? And what I'm thinking, for example, like in my mind, I think, you know, the 20s was the moment of Paris, but then the 30s and 40s is in the moment of Latin Americans going to New York, and we have different moments with more intense contacts in different places. And I think you could do that same kind of analysis with the 19th century, depending on political context, depending on the country. So do we need to nuance this question with, and I think each one of the talks does that, But is there something particular about this transhemispheric exchange that differentiates it from other types of contact, not context? It's a big question.
First idea. Well, all the lectures were about relationship between Latin America and the United States. There was not a lecture about, for example, Argentinians and Mexicans. No? And I think it's about the powerful country and the poor country, but with rich culture, rich ancient culture, the country of exotism and the country of modernity. And I think that generates a dynamic, a dialectic, a very interesting dialectic, never-ending dialectic.
Carmen?
I get in the case of Latino artists, I think the relationship is very, very different than that of other immigrants. It's completely different. European immigrants came to the United States, under very difficult circumstances and all of that, but their nations were not invaded. Their territories were not appropriated. So the relationship between a person of Latino descent and eventually a Latino artist to the United States is completely different than anything that has existed before, with the exception of Native Americans and African Americans. That's where you see this sort of link and similarity in the way certain works and artists have developed, because that relationship is unlike others that we've seen.
Well, unless anyone has further questions, I want to thank all of our speakers today for a really fantastic series of presentations.